G'day, legends. Gather round, because today we're diving into a yarn that's etched itself into the very soul of Australia. A story that sparked a nation's outrage, tore a family apart, and left a scar on our collective memory. We're talking about the Azaria Chamberlain case. A tiny baby, a camping trip under the shadow of Uluru, and a disappearance that baffled police, divided a country, and made a "dingo took my baby," a phrase that still sends shivers down your spine. Was it a wild animal, or something far more sinister? This ain't just a story, it's a confession from the heart of the Outback itself, and once you hear it, you'll never look at a dingo or justice the same way again.
They say the desert remembers. Long after the winds have shifted and the tracks have vanished, the land holds tight to what it's seen. Out here, under the endless vault of a starlit sky, stories echo louder than any man's voice. And one story, etched in blood, grief, and silence, still haunts the red dust beneath Uluru. It begins on a still August night in 1980, with a cry that tore through the calm like a knife through canvas. A baby's cry, sudden, piercing, and then gone. Azaria Chamberlain was just 10 weeks old. Born into a family that wore their faith like a second skin, her arrival should have been marked by peace. Instead, her name would become legend. Her fate, uncertain, disputed, dissected, would fracture a nation's trust and stain the Outback with an accusation too strange to believe. A dingo took my baby. 4 words, spoken by a mother wrapped in shock and silence, echoed endlessly until they became a punchline. But this ain't no joke, mate. This is the truth crawling on its belly through the spinifex. The Chamberlains had come to Uluru like thousands before them, drawn by the monolith's ancient pull, its stillness, its mystery. Michael, a preacher. Lindy, sharp-eyed, reserved. Their boys full of cheek and dust. And Azaria, wrapped tight against the desert chill. A family like any other. But the Outback doesn't care who you are. It doesn't judge. It watches. That night, when the stars blinked like the eyes of spirits long dead, something moved in the dark. Something silent. Something wild. Lindy had heard it, heard the dingo's growl, and then she saw it, emerging from the tent. Something clenched in its jaws. She screamed. People rushed, torches flickered, but in the vastness of that place, with its crimson soil and silence older than memory, Azaria had vanished. Searchers combed the scrub. They called her name into a wind that offered no reply. Tracks were found. Disturbed earth. But no baby, no blood, only theories, only disbelief. And in that vacuum, the public mind began to twist. Was it really a dingo? Could it have been? Or was there something far colder hiding behind the mother's eyes? In the heart of that vast continent, where the horizon stretches till it forgets itself, Uluru rises like a memory the earth refuses to bury. Sacred to the Anangu, feared and revered by those who understand the land, it's not just a rock, it's a story, an old one, older than kings and empires. And in August of 1980, the Chamberlain family came to camp in its shadow, seeking connection, maybe a sliver of adventure. They didn't know that the story waiting for them would be carved into Australia's soul. The trip was meant to be simple, a family holiday, a break from sermons, school runs, and suburban silence. Michael, ever the thoughtful type, drove the yellow Tirana across the red expanse with care. Lindy packed for every eventuality, formula, nappies, even Azaria's little black dress, stitched with care, dark as the night she would vanish into. Their 2 boys, Aiden and Reagan, wrestled in the back seat, faces sticky with sweets and sun. Nothing about them seemed strange. Just another Aussie family pulling up to the edge of the desert, unaware of how close they were to the edge of something else entirely. The campsite at the base of Uluru bustled with fellow travelers, retirees with fold-out chairs, backpackers in threadbare singlets, kids kicking footies in the dirt, the kind of crowd that makes you feel safe by sheer numbers. The Chamberlains pitched their canvas tent near a sandy track, the monolith casting its long, ancient shadow over them. That evening, the smell of sausages on hot plates and billy tea filled the dry air. Someone strummed a guitar. A dingo prowled at the edge of the light, ears twitching, eyes catching the fire's flicker. But no one thought much of it. Dingoes were just part of the bush, weren't they? Scavengers, cautious, unlikely to bother anyone. Azaria slept tucked into her carry cot inside the tent, a soft cocoon of innocence. The desert wind whispered through the flaps as Lindy hovered, ever watchful. She wasn't a woman prone to smiles, but she kept her children close, her hands moving with quiet precision. She believed in order, in faith, in doing things properly. Her voice when she spoke was calm, unhurried. To some, that calm would later feel like distance, coldness, but in that moment it was simply her way of keeping the world from fraying. As the stars came out, bold and bright over the scrub, the Chamberlains sat around the portable stove. Azaria stirred once, then settled again. Lindy glanced toward the tent, something flickering in her expression, protectiveness maybe, or foreboding. Michael poured her tea. Aiden giggled over a story Reagan made up on the spot. The rock behind them loomed like a slumbering god. They were happy. Maybe not in the way some would understand happiness, but they were together. Unaware that everything around them, the dingo circling just beyond the firelight, the open tent flap, the ancient red earth, was already conspiring to rip that happiness apart. Later, in courtrooms and headlines, people would try to make sense of that night. They'd study photographs, analyze facial expressions, and parse Lindy's every word. But none of them were there. None of them felt the wind shift, or saw the way the desert went still just before the scream. None of them heard that final innocent cry cut short by teeth sharper than belief. But for now, there was only the night, only the sound of a breeze whispering over the spinifex. And inside the tent, Azaria Chamberlain slept, dreaming infant dreams no one would ever know. The desert doesn't scream, not usually. It murmurs, hums, sighs. But on the night of August 17, 1980, something tore through the quiet like a blade. It was a cry, thin, high-pitched, unmistakably human. Then, nothing. Not even the wind dared move for a moment. Just a silence so thick you could feel it press against your chest. And then came Lindy's voice, sharper than the air. "That's a dingo. That's got my baby." She moved fast, faster than fear, faster than disbelief. The tent flap was open, not swinging, not fluttering, just ajar enough to feel wrong. Inside, Azaria's carry cot was overturned, the blanket thrown aside like a thing no longer needed. No blood, no noise, just absence. An unbearable, unexplainable absence. Lindy screamed again, this time raw with certainty. A figure had been seen in the dark, low to the ground, moving with intent. A dingo, head lowered, jaws tight around something small. Michael followed her, trying to make sense of it all. There was panic now, voices rising, flashlights clicking on. The scrub lit up in jagged, uncertain flashes. People began to run. Some grabbed torches. Others shouted Azaria's name, as if she might simply have crawled off, as if babies do that. But Lindy knew. She knew before the questions started, before the doubts bloomed. She knew with the cold finality of a mother whose arms had just been emptied by a predator. The search was swift, but the land is vast. Tracks were found, paw prints, they said. But paw prints fade fast in sand. A few torn pieces of fabric, a small trail of drag marks leading into the spinifex, then nothing. The scrub closed behind the moment like water over a stone. Campers who'd seen the dingo earlier stepped forward. They'd watched it move through the tents, bold as anything, unafraid of humans. One had seen it sniffing around the Chamberlain site. Another thought it might have had something in its mouth, but couldn't be sure. The rangers took notes. They'd heard of dingoes scavenging food, sure, even nipping at kids' ankles. But snatching a baby? That had never happened before, or so they said. Michael and Lindy stood together as the search wore on, the night growing colder with every hour. Lindy didn't weep. That would later become ammunition. Her stillness, her dry eyes. People didn't understand it. They expected hysterics, tears, collapse. But grief doesn't read from a script. Sometimes it's a quiet thing, brittle and fierce, that holds a person upright when they should fall. The police arrived and began their own inquiries. They looked at the tent, took photographs, asked questions. Already, suspicion had begun to coil in the air. The dingo theory was too wild, too strange. The animal had no history of such behavior, at least none that people were willing to believe. And Lindy's composure, her clipped words, the odd black dress Azaria had been wearing, all of it fed something darker. Still, the search continued through the night. The light from dozens of torches crisscrossed the bush like desperate fireflies. People called her name. Azaria, again and again. But the Outback, once it takes something, doesn't often give it back. The sand swallows. The spinifex obscures. The heat and silence bind it all in secrecy. By dawn, the certainty had calcified into dread. There would be no baby found curled up under a bush, no lucky discovery. There would be no miracle. Just a family left hollowed by something too cruel to name, and a nation on the cusp of judgment. The sun rose over Uluru, turning the rock blood red. And in that light, the Chamberlains stood alone. Two parents accused by nothing more than nature itself, and a void where their daughter had been. The dingo theory, repeated in Lindy's unwavering voice, sounded impossible. But so too did any alternative. No one had seen a hand raised against Azaria. No evidence of foul play had been found. But still, the whispers grew. The bush can hide anything, they said, but so can people. And in that dawning light, something else began to rise. Not just the sun, but suspicion. The kind that doesn't need facts. The kind that lingers and festers. The kind that would soon turn an unspeakable loss into a courtroom spectacle. The morning after the cry that silenced the desert, the camp at Uluru had changed. Breakfasts went untouched. Conversations stopped when the Chamberlains walked past. The red dust didn't settle. It lingered, like the doubt in people's eyes. What kind of creature takes a child from a tent? A dingo? Really? The question spread faster than footprints in soft sand. Lindy's words were simple. A dingo took my baby. She repeated them without variation. To her, it wasn't theory. It was fact. Etched into her mind as clearly as Azaria's name on a birth certificate. But for the rest of the country, it sounded like a story told too neatly. And as days turned into headlines, and headlines turned into outrage, that neatness became suspicious. You have to understand, mate. This was 1980. Dingoes were wild, sure, but not monsters. Not in the eyes of most. They were scavengers, not killers. Background noise in the Outback Symphony. Not the sort of thing you feared unless you were chucking a chop on the Barbie and one came sniffing. The idea that one could drag a baby from her bed seemed outlandish, unthinkable, which meant, to many, it couldn't be true. The Chamberlain's Seventh-day Adventist faith didn't help either. Australia wasn't as multicultural then as it pretended to be. Religion was a quiet Sunday thing for most folks, something you did, not something you wore like skin. But Michael wore his faith in his sermons. Lindy wore it in her silence. They didn't smoke, didn't drink, and didn't show grief the way others expected. And in the court of public opinion, that made them suspicious. Media took the dingo theory and twisted it. Could a dingo really do it? They asked again and again. And then when the answer didn't satisfy, they turned the question inside out. What if she didn't? Rumors blossomed. Lindy had killed the baby, or Michael had, or both. Some said Azaria wasn't even real. Others whispered of rituals, of cultish sacrifice, madness, all of it. But madness that found willing ears. One newspaper headline read, "Black dress, dark secrets." Another, "Baby-killing cover-up." They plastered Lindy's face across front pages, sometimes mid-blink, mouth set, eyes hard. And people looked at those photos and saw coldness, guilt, something other. Never mind that grief doesn't always show up in tears. Never mind that Lindy had been through the kind of night no mother should ever endure. She didn't act right. And in this country, sometimes that's all it takes. Investigators began pulling apart the Chamberlain's story, microscopes on tent flaps, measuring tapes on paw prints. One ranger said he'd warned about dingo behavior before. Another claimed to have seen one with something in its mouth, but couldn't swear it was a baby. Small pieces, fragments, none of them whole. But stitched together by speculation, they started to resemble something ugly. And all the while, the land watched. Impassive. The same red dust blew through the cracks. The same heat shimmered off the stone. Out here, truth doesn't come easy. You have to earn it. And sometimes, even when you do, no one believes you. The Chamberlains returned home. Azaria's body was never found. A few scraps of clothing, a few prints in the dirt. That was it. No blood, no struggle, just a hole in the middle of their lives that wouldn't close. But still, they held to the story. The dingo took her. That was their truth. That was the only explanation that matched what Lindy saw, what she heard. And yet public trust had slipped through their fingers like sand. People don't like mysteries. They crave resolution, a villain, a motive. And when nature offers only silence, they start to look elsewhere. The mother, the father, anyone whose grief makes them uncomfortable. The more Lindy held fast to her story, the more they questioned it. The more she spoke calmly, the louder others shouted. So the question became not just whether a dingo could take a baby, but whether a mother could lie. And once that seed was planted, it grew fast, deep, poisonous. The desert had claimed Azaria. But now something else was being claimed too. Her memory, her truth, the very shape of what happened that night. The dingo theory, once a cry in the dark, had become a whisper against a storm. And soon, that storm would arrive in full force, in television broadcasts, in courtrooms, and in every living room across the country. Because in a place as vast as Australia, sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the wild, it's what we decide to believe. In the weeks that followed Azaria's disappearance, the dust of Uluru had barely begun to settle before the nation turned its gaze inward, not toward the desert for answers, but toward the family who'd brought the mystery into their living rooms. The Chamberlains weren't just grieving parents anymore. They were suspects, symbols, characters in a national drama no one had asked for, but everyone was desperate to direct. The media moved fast, too fast. What had started as cautious coverage became a runaway beast, devouring facts and spitting out speculation. Television screens flickered with Lindy's face, sometimes stoic, sometimes strained, always scrutinized. Every blink, every tilt of the head was dissected by talking heads and pub patrons alike. Her voice, clipped and steady, was seen not as strength, but as ice. Her composure became a weapon used against her. "Why isn't she crying?" they asked. What kind of mother talks like that? They didn't want truth. They wanted emotion, the kind that photographs well. And when they didn't find it, they filled the gap with outrage. Papers ran wild. "Murder or mistake?" screamed one headline. "Mother in black. Why so calm?" asked another. Lindy's religion, her clothes, even her accent were turned into pieces of a puzzle she never built. They questioned her decision to dress Azaria in black, forgetting that in some cultures, black is not always a color of mourning but of tradition. They mocked the family's faith, their abstinence, their refusal to play the role of perfect, weeping victims. What didn't fit the script was deemed sinister. Michael, too, felt the burn of that spotlight. His sermons were replayed and reinterpreted. His faith painted him as rigid, dogmatic. People whispered that he was hiding something, that no man could remain that calm unless he knew more than he let on. And beneath all that noise, the truth, the unbearable, ordinary truth of a child taken by nature, was buried. Protesters began appearing outside the court hearings. They held signs, "Justice for Azaria." But the implication wasn't justice against the wild. It was justice against the parents. Accusation had become theater. People gathered not to grieve, but to gawk. They didn't need a trial to decide guilt. They already had their verdict. At barbecues and bus stops, in office tea rooms and primary school staff lounges, The case was all anyone talked about. The country split down the middle, not between believers and skeptics, but between those who trusted the desert and those who trusted only what they could see on the 6 o'clock news. The Chamberlains were no longer seen as people, but as stories, symbols of grief, suspicion, and something darker no one could quite name. Radio hosts called it the Uluru murder. TV commentators compared Lindy to film villains, her silence painted as smugness. The truth didn't stand a chance, because truth is quiet. It doesn't shout over commercial breaks. It doesn't draw ratings. By the time the legal wheels began to turn, the outcome already felt inevitable. Not because of evidence, but because of perception. And perception, as the Chamberlains would learn, is a cruel master. It feeds on difference, consumes certainty and replaces it with narrative. And the Outback, for all its silence, had been drowned out, its truths ignored. The Dingo's tracks erased by the stampede of public judgment. What began as a tragedy was now a witch hunt. And Lindy, in the eyes of millions, wore the cloak of guilt not because of what she did, but because of how she did not cry, did not collapse, did not play the role assigned to her. She stood in the wind of a nation's fury, shoulders square, mouth set, voice calm. Not because she wasn't broken, but because she refused to let the storm see her fall. By 1982, the full machinery of the law had turned its gaze on Lindy Chamberlain. The investigators, pressured by public demand and driven by a thirst for answers, built their case not on irrefutable truth, but on shadows and suggestions. The Dingo theory had become too unbelievable, too untidy. The world wanted closure. And sometimes, mate, when you want something bad enough, you start carving the evidence to fit the ending you've already imagined. The prosecution's story was chilling. They claimed Lindy had murdered Azaria, cut her throat in the front seat of the family's yellow Torana, disposed of the body, and then calmly raised the alarm, spinning a tale of a wild dog under the cloak of night. The motive? Vague at best. The method? Largely speculative. But they had what they believed was enough. A jumpsuit found stained, alleged blood in the car, a forensic expert who claimed the marks resembled an infant's handprint. Lindy, 8 months pregnant by the time the trial began, sat in court every day with the same composed face the public had already condemned. To some, that stoicism reeked of guilt. To others, it was the only thing keeping her from shattering entirely. The courtroom itself was a theater. Cameras flashing outside, reporters hanging on every word inside. Every glance between Michael and Lindy was weighed for hidden meaning. Every moment she didn't cry, every time she crossed her arms, every sigh, became another line in the prosecution's argument. This was not a mother in mourning, they insisted. This was a woman with something to hide. But the science they leaned on, what little there was shaky ground. The supposed bloodstains in the car. Later testing would show it was a spray used in manufacturing. The alleged handprint? An illusion? The forensic process? Rushed. But that reckoning would come too late, because the court was not only full of evidence, it was full of ghosts. The ghost of Azaria. The ghost of truth obscured by pressure. The ghost of public fury hanging like dust in the rafters. Jurors, just ordinary folk, watched Lindy with eyes already clouded by headlines and hearsay. They didn't see grief. They saw something unfamiliar. And in the unfamiliar, they saw danger. The verdict came down like thunder on dry earth. Guilty. Lindy Chamberlain, convicted of murder. Michael, convicted as an accessory. She was sentenced to life. He was given a suspended sentence. No body, no murder weapon, no motive. Just the overwhelming, suffocating weight of collective doubt made flesh in a courtroom. As she was led away, her pregnancy hidden beneath a prison uniform, the country felt a strange, cold satisfaction. Justice, they said, had been served. The mother had lied. The mystery had a villain. The chaos had order again. But some, even then, felt a tremor beneath that verdict. A quiet disquiet. A sense that something was deeply wrong. That the desert hadn't spoken its last word. In Berrima jail, Lindy gave birth to her 4th child, Kalia. Behind bars, under the constant scrutiny of guards, doctors, and fellow inmates, she mothered a child in captivity, her body a vessel, her soul a battleground, and still she insisted, "I did not kill my daughter. The Dingo did." And somewhere out there, beyond the walls and the whispers, the Outback remained unchanged. It didn't care who was locked up. It didn't bend to verdicts. It only kept its secrets. Watching. Waiting. Justice had been declared. But truth, as always, remained just out of reach. Half buried in the red dirt, caught between a cry in the night and a verdict etched in stone. Prison has a sound, they say. Not just the clanging of gates or the echo of footsteps on concrete, but something quieter, heavier. The sound of waiting, of time thickening. Lindy Chamberlain heard that sound every day. In Berrima Jail, where the air was thick with heat and judgment, she rocked her newborn behind bars, far from the red earth that had swallowed Azaria, and even farther from a country that had turned its back on her. She served years there, her pleas echoing into silence. Michael on the outside kept fighting, submitting appeals, facing reporters with tired eyes. But the truth, like everything out here, moved slowly, if at all. Most had accepted the verdict. The nation had moved on, or told itself it had. Another face in the paper, another tragedy to debate over beers. But the desert has its own sense of timing, and sometimes when it chooses to speak, it does so in whispers that carry more weight than any gavel. It was 1986 when that whisper finally came. A British tourist named David Brett fell from a cliff near Uluru during a night hike. A tragic accident. Search parties were sent out. Crews combed the base of the monolith, eyes scanning the scrub for signs of a body. And there, tangled in the roots and red dust, buried partially beneath sand and leaves near a known dingo lair, they found something else. A small, faded baby jacket. Red. Worn. Half covered by years of dirt and silence. It matched the description of the garment Lindy had insisted Azaria had been wearing the night she disappeared, something the prosecution had argued had never existed. But there it was, where the Chamberlains always said it might be, not in the car, not in some hidden grave, in the open. Carried, perhaps dropped by the creature no one had believed, that one piece of cloth changed everything. The evidence was undeniable. The jacket's location matched the family's original statements, fit the theory mocked for years. The police had no choice but to reevaluate the case. Within weeks, Lindy Chamberlain was released from prison. Not exonerated, not yet. But free, for now. Allowed to breathe the outside air again, though it was thick with the same old judgment. She stepped out into the flash of cameras and the roar of reporters. Pale, thinner. Her face carried new lines carved by sleepless nights and broken hope. She blinked into the sun like someone emerging from a cave. The world had changed little in her absence, but she had changed completely. For Michael, the discovery was bittersweet. Vindication, perhaps. But at what cost? Years lost. A daughter dead, a wife condemned, a family shattered under the weight of a country's doubt. No discovery could bring Azaria back. No press conference could erase what had been said in pubs, on television, across dinner tables. The jacket said what Lindy had said all along. A dingo took her baby. And yet the scars remained. Because the damage wasn't just legal. It was personal. It was spiritual. They'd been branded. People spoke of apologies, but few came. Fewer still were genuine. The silence from those who once shouted the loudest said everything. And out there beyond the courts and cameras, the bush remained unrepentant. The same place where Azaria had vanished, where the dingo had vanished, where justice itself had vanished, was still there. Still wild, still ancient, still holding back more than it gave. The red jacket had surfaced. But the truth, it was only beginning to emerge. It took 32 years for the system to say aloud what Lindy Chamberlain had uttered on the very night her daughter vanished. 32 years of trials, retrials, appeals, commissions, and inquests. 32 years of her words repeated like a litany. A dingo took my baby, echoing into rooms that didn't want to listen. In 2012, inside a solemn courtroom in Darwin, the final coroner's inquest was held. The room was quiet, heavy with expectation, though few believed anything new could be said. Most had long since moved on. A new generation had grown up only knowing the phrase as a cruel meme, a punchline. But for those who had lived it, who had carried the weight of it every day, this was no formality. This was the reckoning. Coroner Elizabeth Morris delivered her findings with the gravity the moment demanded. The courtroom stilled as the words fell. The cause of Azaria Chamberlain's death was as the result of being attacked and taken by a dingo. No ambiguity, no hedging, not possibly, not likely. A direct acknowledgement, a correction, a truth, hard and irreversible, finally given the dignity of being named. There were no cheers, no applause, just silence, the kind that settles after a long, bitter storm. Lindy sat with Michael beside her, older now, worn by years of injustice, but unbroken. Her face bore the same calm she had always shown, but this time it held something else too. Sadness, yes, but peace. A quiet strength earned the hardest way possible. Outside, the headlines changed. This time they said Lindy vindicated, Dingo confirmed, justice finally. But the country had spent decades looking away, blaming, doubting, and now, faced with the truth it once rejected, it had little to say. No courtroom apology could return what was taken. Not just Azaria, but time, trust, dignity. Michael never quite recovered. The years had bent him, not in bitterness, but in sorrow. He had defended his family, his wife, his faith, in a world that saw all three as foreign. And though the verdict brought closure, it also reopened wounds that had never truly healed. For Lindy, the coroner's words were the end of a long fight, but not the end of pain. That had become part of her. A part she carried in interviews, in silence, in the measured way she told her story again and again. Not for sympathy, but for clarity, for history, because the truth matters, even when it's delayed, especially when it is. And through it all, the Outback remained indifferent. The land that had held Azaria's jacket, that had swallowed her body, never changed. It had been silent not out of malice, but because silence is what the desert offers. A mirror, not a verdict. A place where the human need for answers is dwarfed by a sky too big to care. So the case was closed. Officially, finally. But its echo lives on. Not just in documents or documentaries, but in the way we talk about justice, about women, about grief. It lives in the reminder that the improbable is not the impossible, that truth does not always wear the face we expect, and that sometimes the land speaks last. Long after the coroner's final words were spoken and the cameras packed away, the legacy of Azaria Chamberlain's case remained like a scar on the nation's conscience. Not visible to the eye, perhaps, but deeply felt. Etched in the way Australians spoke about justice, grief, and what it means to believe someone whose pain doesn't match our expectations. The Outback had always been a place of myth. Vast, untamed, beautiful, and brutal. But after 1980, it became something else too. A symbol of how quickly the line between nature and narrative could blur. The dingo, once seen as a nuisance or curiosity, became a creature of nightmare and courtroom evidence. Parks authorities across the country installed new warnings. Signs went up. Do not feed the dingoes. Supervise children at all times. A kind of quiet admission that maybe Lindy had been right all along. But while the Outback learned to take responsibility for its predators, Australia struggled to do the same with its institutions. The case became required study for law students, not just as a miscarriage of justice, but as a masterclass in how public opinion, media pressure, and forensic failure can conspire to create a perfect storm. And yet, it wasn't just the system that had failed, it was the people too. We wanted a story. We wanted the parents to be monsters because the alternative, that something wild could slip into our tents and take our children, was too terrifying to accept. Easier to blame a mother who didn't weep the right way than to admit the bush could be that cruel, that indifferent. Over time, documentaries, books, and retrospectives tried to untangle the mess. But the truth had always been simple. A baby. A predator. A family torn apart by something none of them could control. The rest, suspicions, accusations, trials, was noise. Tragic, unnecessary noise. And through it all, Lindy never folded. She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't craft an image. She told her story over and over, because she knew the cost of silence. And in doing so, she taught us something we were slow to learn, that strength doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like standing alone, again and again, against a storm you didn't cause. Today, when people remember the case, they often go straight to the phrase, those 5 words mocked and misunderstood for decades. But behind them is a deeper lesson, one that lingers like heat in the sand. That truth can be wild and strange, that justice can take decades to catch up, and that sometimes the thing we fear most isn't the wild. It's how little we trust each other when the story doesn't fit neatly. Azaria's name became legend, but it should never have had to. She was just a baby, taken too soon, lost to the night. Her life and the storm that followed showed us the limits of our empathy and the power of our assumptions. And the Outback, that old sunburnt witness, still whispers the tale to those willing to listen. Not in words, but in wind, in silence, in the long shadows cast by the rock. Because in the end, the bush remembers, and it never forgets the truth. Time passes differently in the bush. Out here, things aren't measured in headlines or trials, but in seasons, in storms, in the slow erosion of stone and memory. And yet, some stories never fade. They live in the dust, in the gorges, in the distant howl of something wild moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. The Azaria Chamberlain case is one of those stories. It began with a cry and ended with a whisper. A mother's voice, worn by decades, finally echoed by a court that took far too long to listen. And though the case is closed, its shadow still lingers across the red earth like the trace of a creature long gone. Because it wasn't just about a dingo, or a baby, or a trial. It was about the way we look at pain that doesn't behave. The way we demand theater from grief. The way we weaponize our disbelief when reality feels too strange to bear. The Outback doesn't care about our doubts. It never did. It offered no apology, no explanation, just silence. And in that silence, Azaria vanished. Not as myth, not as metaphor, but as a child, a real breathing child. And if we forget that, if we let her become just another line in a cautionary tale, then we've failed her all over again. Even now at the base of Uluru, when the wind picks up and the sun slips behind the monolith's edge, you can feel the weight of that night. Not as fear, but as remembering. The place still holds it, quiet, unchanged. The way the tent flaps fluttered, the shape of a mother running. The stillness that followed. We tell stories here not to entertain, but to remember. To listen to the land. To understand that out there, beyond the edge of reason, there are truths stranger than fiction, and sorrows deeper than what the news will show. This was one of them. So what do we do now with this tale that once divided a nation? We remember it, not with judgment, but with humility. We carry it like a scar, visible, yes, but also a sign that we learned, that we listened, that we now know better what justice should look like and how fragile it really is. Azaria Chamberlain's name is carved into more than just court documents or gravestones. It's etched into the soul of a country that, for a time, forgot how to believe. Her story is a reminder that sometimes the wildest truth is the real one, and that sometimes the monsters aren't out there in the dark, but inside us, in our need to blame, to explain, to control. So next time you hear the wind move across the plains or see a dingo tracing the horizon, don't look away. Listen, because the bush, even now, still has stories to tell. And not all of them end the way we expect. Until next time, stay safe. And remember, the Outback never lies, it just waits.